spring of 1987, at a farm equipment liquidation sale outside of Innisfail, Alberta, a 41-year-old woman named Hazel Drummond paid $85 for a 1962 Massey Ferguson 35 that had been sitting behind a collapsed equipment shed for the better part of 8 years. The tractor was, by any reasonable measure, finished. The front axle was cracked along the casting. The injection pump had seized from sitting with water in the fuel. Both rear wheel seals had failed so completely that the final drives had run dry, and the differential oil that remained was the consistency of gray paste. The hood was caved in on the left side where something heavy had fallen on it. The rear linkage arms were bent, one of them nearly 20 degrees out of true. A family of starlings had nested in the engine cowling for what looked like 3 consecutive seasons. When the sale operator walked past it during the preview, he didn't stop. He kept moving the way people do when they've already written something off. The bidding, when it came, was almost ceremonial. Somebody give me $50. Nobody moved. $50 for the whole machine. A scrap dealer in a gray hat shifted his weight. $60. Hazel said $85. The scrap dealer looked at her. He looked at the tractor. He did not bid again. Sold to the woman in the green jacket. Her neighbor at the time, a man named Phil Warwick, who'd driven her to the sale that morning, helped her wrestle the machine onto the flat-deck trailer she'd borrowed from her cousin. The Massey groaned the whole way up the ramps. Phil stood at the tailgate and looked at what they'd loaded. "Hazel, what exactly is the plan here?" "Fix it. That front axle is cracked." "I know." "The injection pump is seized." "I know that too." Phil had known Hazel Drummond for 11 years, and he'd never once won an argument with her. He wrapped the tie-down straps around the front axle without another word, and they drove back east toward the Drummond property on the flat road out of town, the Massey rattling on the deck behind them like it was trying to fall apart before it even got a chance to be saved. By the end of that week, the township had something new to talk about. Hazel Drummond bought the Massey nobody wanted, the one with the cracked axle and the seized pump, paid $85 for it, $85 for a pile of cast iron that belonged in a ditch. The story moved the way stories move in agricultural townships in central Alberta, from the co-op in Innisfail to the coffee counter at the Esso in Bowden, from Bowden to the grain elevator at Penhold, from Penhold to the church basement at the Wednesday supper. And at every stop, the story picked up a little more disbelief, a little more amusement, and a little more of the particular condescension that certain communities reserve for women who do things men have decided aren't worth doing. Because Hazel Drummond was not the kind of person the township expected to be buying salvage tractors. Let me tell you about Hazel Drummond. Because what she did with that Massey Ferguson over the next 14 months only makes sense if you understand who she was before any of this started. Hazel was born in 1946 on a quarter section of mixed grain and cow-calf operation east of Olds, Alberta. Her father, Clarence Drummond, was a man who'd grown up during the Depression and carried that era's particular arithmetic with him for the rest of his life. He didn't distrust banks exactly. He distrusted the relationship between debt and weather. In Alberta, weather could not be negotiated with. A loan payment did not care about late frost or a wet harvest. Those two facts, held together, shaped everything Clarence believed about how a farm should be run. He also fixed everything himself, not as a point of pride, but as a matter of logic. If the machine broke and you couldn't fix it, the machine owned you. Clarence didn't intend to be owned by machinery. He kept a shop on the north side of the yard, concrete pad, a barrel stove, a workbench he'd built himself from rough-cut spruce, and a collection of tools that had accumulated over 25 years of fixing what other people would have replaced. There was a floor jack he'd bought second-hand from a service station in Red Deer in 1961. There was a drill press with a cracked belt guard that worked perfectly despite looking like it shouldn't. There was a set of machinist's files, a tap and die set, and a hydraulic press he built from pipe and channel iron and a bottle jack, a machine that had no business working as well as it did. Hazel was the middle of 3 children. Her older brother Ken joined the Army and came back quiet. Her younger brother Dale took a job with a pipeline company and eventually moved to Fort McMurray. Hazel stayed, not by default, by decision. She'd been accepted to the nursing program at the Red Deer College in 1965. She had the entrance scores. She had a room arranged with a woman on 47th Avenue. She had a suitcase half-packed on the floor of her bedroom on the last day of August. That morning, Clarence went to start the swather and found he couldn't get out of the cab on his own. His hip had been quietly failing for 2 years. He'd told no one. Hazel unpacked the suitcase. She told the college she'd come next year. Next year became the year after. The year after became something she stopped counting. She took over the field work the way water fills a low spot. Gradually, then completely, then so naturally that people forgot it hadn't always been that way. By 1970, when she was 24, she was running the grain operation, managing the cow-calf herd through calving and keeping the books. Clarence supervised from the shop doorway, sitting on a metal stool, contributing observations that decreased in frequency as Hazel's competence increased, and as Clarence, slowly and without fanfare, understood that his daughter had surpassed him. What she had was a quality that's difficult to name but immediately visible if you worked alongside her. She saw inefficiency the way some people see color. Not a learned skill. A reflex. When something cost more than it needed to, something in Hazel noticed it, with the same involuntary precision as noticing a sound out of place. She wasn't tight with money in the pinched, fearful way. She simply could not tolerate waste. Every unnecessary dollar that left the operation was an argument lost to someone who wasn't even in the room. She kept records, a hardbound ledger, one per year, every expense entered in columns, every repair documented with parts cost and labor hours. Not because she enjoyed the accounting, because the ledger was the only thing that couldn't lie to her. Clarence died in the winter of 1979, in the hospital in Red Deer, which surprised no one because Clarence had refused to go to the hospital for so long that by the time he went, there was no choice. He left Hazel the quarter section, the equipment, a modest herd, and a savings account that held $22,000 in it. This was for a 320-acre mixed operation in central Alberta that had never carried a mortgage, a reasonable sum. A testament to Clarence's particular brand of stubbornness. Hazel was 33. She owned a paid-for farm with no debt of any kind. Her brothers asked if she wanted help. She thanked them. She didn't call. Now, the Massey Ferguson 35. When Hazel looked at that cracked, seized, battered tractor sitting on the borrowed flat deck in her yard, she didn't see what everyone else saw. Everyone else saw a machine that had used itself up. Hazel saw a machine that had used itself up. Hazel saw a machine that had been abandoned before it was actually finished. Here is what Hazel knew that the township didn't. The Massey Ferguson 35 had one of the most robust rear axle assemblies of any compact tractor produced in that era. The transmission was a 6-speed, with a live PTO shaft that had been over-engineered from the factory, built to handle loads the original engine could never fully demand. The final drives were cast iron, heavy, precise. Massey had been conservative in their tolerances and generous in their material, the combination that produces things that last. The rear end of the MF-35 was not the problem. The rear end was the reason. And the engine, a Perkins A3, 152, a 3-cylinder diesel of 152 cubic inches, was not the engine Hazel intended to keep. Adequate was the word for it. Adequate was not a word Hazel found useful. 11 months before the auction in the spring of 1986, Hazel had driven to a dispersal sale north of Lacombe. A mixed farm was liquidating after the second worst year of the Alberta farm crisis, and among the equipment was a Lister Petter TS3, a 3-cylinder diesel that had been removed from a generator set when the generator frame had been crushed by a grain bin collapse. The engine itself had not been touched. It was running when they took it out. The frame had caught the collapse, not the motor. Nobody at the sale wanted an engine without a machine. Hazel paid $95 for it. She pulled the Lister from the seller's yard that afternoon, loaded it into the back of her pickup wrapped in a furniture blanket, and brought it home. Here is what mattered. The Lister Petter TS3 produced 37 horsepower at the flywheel, compared to the Perkins A3.152's 28. 9 horsepower is not a dramatic number on paper. In a field, pulling a piece of equipment through wet Alberta clay in shoulder season, those 9 horsepower were the difference between working and struggling. But the displacement wasn't the main point. The main point was the torque curve. The Lister Petter produced its peak torque at significantly lower RPM than the Perkins, which meant it pulled hard without revving hard, which meant it was easier on the drivetrain, easier on fuel, and quieter by a margin anyone standing nearby would notice. Hazel had spent 6 weeks in Clarence's shop with both engines before the auction, measuring mounting feet, comparing flywheel housings, sketching clearance problems on graph paper, working through the geometry of whether a Lister Petter could live inside a Massey Ferguson 35 chassis. She'd identified 3 problems and solved 2 of them before she ever raised her hand to bid. The third she believed she could solve with a custom adapter and a morning on the drill press. That was why nobody understood the purchase. They saw a woman spending $85 on impulse at a salvage auction. They were watching a woman execute the final step of a plan 11 months in the making. The rebuild began in October of 1987, after the harvest was in and the cows were settled for winter. Hazel stripped the Massey to the frame on the shop floor, laying components out in the order and position from which they'd been removed. Clarence had taught her that a map of the machine spread on concrete is worth more than any parts diagram. You can see what belongs where. You can see what's missing. You can see what should have been replaced 3 owners ago. The frame was sound. Alberta winters had done their work on the sheet metal and the rubber and the exposed castings, but the main rails were straight and solid. Hazel wire brushed them to bare metal, primed them, and painted them with the dark red-gray primer she kept in 5-gallon cans in the corner of the shop. Not for appearance, for protection. Rust was a slow and patient enemy, and she had no patience for slow and patient enemies. The rear transmission and final drive assembly she pulled as a complete unit and set on blocks. She drained the gray paste that had been the differential oil and was briefly impressed by how thoroughly the seals had failed. She split the transmission case and inspected every gear and shaft and bearing. The gears were fine. Not just serviceable, fine. 25 years old, and the teeth were clean. No chips, no scoring on the contact faces, no measurable wear. Massey had built this drivetrain to outlast several engines. Hazel replaced the bearings, seals, and O-rings. Parts from Napa and Innisfail totaled $52. She torqued everything to spec using a torque wrench she'd bought used from a mechanic in Olds who'd retired, and reassembled the transmission with clean gear oil. The cracked front axle was the first real problem. The crack ran 6 inches along the casting, starting at a stress riser near the kingpin boss. A weld repair on cast iron is possible but risky. Done wrong, it cracks again in the same place within a season. Hazel had welded cast iron before. She knew the rules. Preheat the castings slowly and evenly. Use nickel rod. Weld short passes. Peen immediately. Wrap it and let it cool over 48 hours, not overnight. She set up 2 propane torches on either side of the axle housing and spent 90 minutes bringing the temperature up before she struck the first arc. She welded it in the shop on a Tuesday afternoon while a January wind ran under the door gap and moved sawdust across the floor. She wrapped the axle in an old horse blanket and left it on the workbench for 2 full days. When she unwrapped it and ground the weld flush and inspected it, the repair was solid. She had Clarence's eye for a weld. She always had. The seized injection pump was the second real problem. Rebuilding a Perkins injection pump requires precision and cleanliness that a farm shop can provide if the farmer is disciplined enough about both. Hazel was. She disassembled the pump on a clean sheet of plywood she'd wiped with solvent. She identified the failure, a corroded plunger that had swelled fractionally in its barrel from sitting with contaminated fuel. She honed the barrel with a brass lap in a slow hand, worked the plunger back to tolerance, replaced the delivery valves with a kit she'd ordered from a diesel parts house in Calgary, and reassembled the pump in the same careful sequence. The kit had cost $38. The afternoon had cost her nothing but time, which was the one resource on a paid-for farm that could be managed entirely by the person running it. Now the engine. The Lister Petter TS3 had been sitting in the corner of the shop since April of 1986, covered with a canvas tarp. Hazel had gone through it once methodically in the summer of that year. New injectors, new glow plugs, valve clearances set, injector timing checked and adjusted, fresh filters. The engine had been in good condition when she bought it, and it was in better condition now. The problem was the fit. The Lister's mounting feet were positioned on a different geometry than the Perkins mounts in the Massey chassis. The flywheel housing bolt pattern was different. The starter motor location was different. The cooling system outlet was on the opposite side. Hazel had solved 3 of these 4 problems in the shop before the auction. The 4th, the starter motor conflict, she resolved by sourcing a left-hand rotation starter from a tractor wrecker in Ponoka that happened to have a Lister engine on its parts shelf from a different application entirely. The starter cost $22 and fit without modification. The adapter plate between the Lister flywheel housing and the Massey gearbox input was the precision work. Hazel made it from half-inch steel plate she'd bought as drops from a fabrication shop in Red Deer, paying scrap metal price. She laid out the bolt patterns on the plate with a scribe and a combination square, working from measurements she'd taken with a micrometer and transferred to graph paper, then center-punched each hole location and drilled them on Clarence's drill press. The drill press had been bought in 1958. It drilled as well as anything new. The center pilot bore, she stepped up through 6 drill sizes and finished with a reamer she borrowed from the retired mechanic in Olds, a man named Art, who kept his tools in better condition than most people kept their houses. The adapter plate took 4 evenings over 2 weeks, not because it was beyond her skill, because it had to be right. A plate that was out of true by a fraction would destroy the input shaft bearing in a single season of work. Hazel measured each hole after drilling and compared it to her layout. She was within 0.02 on every one. When she mated the Lister to the Massey gearbox on the shop floor, the shafts aligned without any persuasion. Either the measurement was right or it wasn't. It was. She bolted the engine into the chassis in February of 1988. New rubber mounts cut from a section of conveyor belting she'd kept for exactly this kind of purpose since Clarence had brought it home from somewhere in 1974. She fabricated new throttle linkage from steel rod, bent cold in the vise to the angles she needed. She plumbed the fuel system with new line and a filter canister she'd salvaged from a junked truck at a local wrecker. She connected the cooling system with a combination of hose, clamps, and a brass fitting she turned on the small lathe in the back corner of the shop, Clarence's lathe. The last time it had been used before this was 1982 to make a bushing for a grain auger. The cutting oil in the reservoir was still good. She rewired the electrical system from the ignition switch forward. New wiring harness, hand-built from bulk wire and connectors she'd bought at the parts counter in Innisfail. New alternator wiring to match the Lister's charging system. Clean connections. Heat shrink over every joint. $41 in parts. One evening. The rear tires she sourced from a tire dealer in Bowdoin got a mismatched set from a trade-in. Both the right size, both with acceptable tread. $60 for the pair. The seat had been repairable. She re-welded the mounting bracket, replaced the foam with a piece cut from an old mattress, and recovered it with vinyl from a roll she'd had in the shop since she'd done the tractor cab seats 2 years earlier. The color didn't match. It didn't need to. Total investment. The Massey 35 chassis, $85. The Lister Petter engine from the Lacombe sale, $95. Engine service parts, $61. Transmission and final drive rebuild, $52. Injection pump rebuild, $52. Injection pump rebuild kit, $38. Front axle welding consumables, $14. Adapter plate steel, $19. Starter motor, $22. Fuel and electrical components, $41. Tires, $60. Miscellaneous hardware, $23. Total $510. 14 months. One woman, one shop, her father's tools. Hazel started the Massey for the first time on a Saturday morning in late March of 1988. She turned the key, waited for the glow plugs, and pressed the starter. The Lister turned over once, twice, fired on the 3rd compression stroke, and settled into an idle that was smoother and quieter than any MF-35 that had ever left the factory in Coventry. The exhaust note was different, lower, more deliberate, the sound of an engine that was not working hard at idle because it didn't need to. She let it warm up for 15 minutes, watching the temperature gauge, listening to the valve train, running a hand along the adapter plate to feel for vibration. There was none. The plate was true. She drove it out of the shop and into the field behind the yard. She'd put a 3-furrow plow on the drawbar. An original Massey 35 with the Perkins engine could manage a 2-furrow without complaint. 3 was where it started to labor, where you could hear the RPMs drop and feel the steering go light as the front end hunted for traction. She dropped the plow into the headland, opened the throttle to working position, and drove south. The lister pulled all 3 furrows through the cold Alberta soil without changing its voice. No lug, no strain, no front end rising. Just steady, unhurried forward motion. The sound of an engine running below its capability, because the work being asked of it was within its capability. 9 extra horsepower sounds like a small thing. In a field, it is not a small thing. It is the difference between a tractor working and a tractor deciding. Hazel's tractor was deciding. Phil Warwick was dissing his adjacent field that morning, and he shut down his tractor and watched her make 4 passes. Then he drove his pickup to the fence line and waited until she pulled up to the headland. That doesn't sound like a Massey engine. It's not. What is it? Lister Petter 3-cylinder diesel, out of a generator set from the Lacombe sale last year. Phil looked at the tractor. He looked at Hazel. He was a man who'd farmed his whole life and knew exactly what a 3-furrow plow looked like behind an MF-35 with its original engine. It looked like optimism. How much did that cost you total? $510. Phil Warwick owned 2 John Deere 2040s that had cost him a combined $9,000 2 years earlier. He was standing at a fence line in central Alberta, looking at a tractor pulling 3 furrows for $510. He was quiet for a long time. Farmers are quiet for a long time when the arithmetic doesn't line up with what they thought they knew. Your dad would have figured this out 20 years ago. He would have told me the hood paint was uneven. Phil laughed. It was the first time anyone in the township had laughed about Hazel Drummond's tractor project without it being at her expense. The word spread, not the way the original joke had spread, fast and from person to person with the energy of people sharing something funny. This was different. This was farmers telling other farmers something they'd witnessed with their own eyes, and farmers in Alberta in 1988 were not in a position to dismiss information about reducing operating costs. The farm crisis of the mid-'80s had not finished with them. Interest rates were still not kind. Land values had not recovered. The men who'd expanded on credit during the boom years of the 70s, who'd bought new iron and new acres and new buildings on borrowed money, were still carrying the weight of that borrowing. Some of them were carrying it badly. By July, 4 men from the surrounding townships had driven to the Drummond place to see the Massey running. By September, 2 of them had asked Hazel if she could do the same thing for their equipment. She said she'd think about it. She thought about it through the fall and into the winter of 1988, sitting with her ledger and a cup of tea at the kitchen table, working the numbers the way Clarence had taught her. What does it cost? What does it return? Where is the gap? And is the gap honest? In the spring of 1989, she said yes to the first one. His name was Ed Kowalski, and he had a 1958 International B250 with an original engine that was burning oil past the rings and had been for 2 seasons. Hazel sourced a replacement diesel from an equipment dealer in Lacombe, who sometimes had surplus power units from irrigation pump sets, built an adapter plate on Clarence's drill press, and had the International running on the new engine in 5 weeks. She charged Ed $175 for her labor. Ed supplied the parts. His total cost came in under $600. A dealer engine rebuild would have been $1,400. A comparable used tractor in running condition would have been $5,500. A second job followed that summer, a third that fall, a fourth the following spring. Hazel never advertised. She never had to. A farmer would mention it to another farmer at the elevator. That farmer would tell his brother-in-law. The brother-in-law had a machine with a tired engine and no room in his operating budget for a dealer repair. Eventually, he'd find his way to the Drummond yard, coming up the driveway with the careful slowness of someone who wasn't sure they deserved to be there. She always made time for them. She wasn't generous with time in any loose or sentimental sense. She was generous with time the way her father had been, precisely, with the understanding that knowledge shared to the right person comes back around. Let me tell you about what happened over the next decade and a half, because this is where the story stops being about a tractor. Hazel farmed her quarter section with the Lister-powered Massey from 1988 through the early part of the new century. The engine never gave her reason for concern. It started reliably in temperatures that discouraged other machines. It ran clean. It asked for oil changes and valve checks, and it received them, and that was the entirety of its requirements. She kept her operating costs where Clarence had kept his, as close to nothing as the land and the climate would allow. She bought seed at the best price she could negotiate, which was usually a better price than her neighbors paid, because she was known to pay immediately and without complication. She sold grain on her schedule, not the market schedule, because she had the storage to wait and the absence of debt that made waiting possible. She culled her cowherd ruthlessly and without sentiment, keeping only the animals that performed. The numbers she put away each year were not dramatic. 12,000 in a good year, 6,000 in a difficult one. But she put them away with the consistency of a person who understood that saving is not what happens after spending. Saving is what happens before spending begins. By the spring of 1996, Hazel had $104,000 in savings. And in the spring of 1996, the Hendricks place came to sale. 160 acres, sharing her eastern fence line, land her father had coveted in a quiet way for 30 years without ever having the cash to act on it when it came available. It was black soil, flat, well-drained, the kind of land that doesn't need management so much as it needs attention. The estate was selling it for reasons that had nothing to do with the land's quality and everything to do with family disagreement and legal process, the way the best parcels often come to market. The listing price was $490 an acre. The real estate agent had suggested the executor might consider $44. A land investment group from Calgary had already expressed interest. They were buying Alberta agricultural land systematically that spring, the way outside capital does when local liquidity is constrained. They moved fast and paid in a narrower range of what the land was actually worth. They had a ceiling defined by a spreadsheet. Hazel had no ceiling defined by a spreadsheet. She had $104,000 in a bank account, a clear understanding of what that land would produce in her hands, and no interest in losing it to investors who would rent it back to someone at rates that would make the margins punishing. The auction was on a Wednesday. Hazel drove herself. The land group opened at $420 an acre. Hazel went to $440. The land group went to $460. Hazel went to $475. The land group went to $490. Their agent was on a phone, and the pause before each bid was the pause of a man consulting a limit. Hazel went to $510. The land group's agent put the phone to his ear, listened, and set it on the table. $510 an acre, the auctioneer said. 160 acres. Do I hear $510-25? He did not hear $525. Sold. Method of payment. Bank draft, Hazel said. I have it here. The room, which had been a room of farmers watching two bidders, became briefly a room of people doing arithmetic. 160 acres at $510 was $81,600. Cash. From a woman who'd spent the better part of a decade fixing other people's tractors in her father's shop. A woman who'd never bought a new piece of equipment in her life. A woman whose most expensive tractor had cost her $510. Though Warwick was there, he found her after the paperwork was done. You came prepared. I've been prepared since 1992, Hazel said. I just had to wait for the right parcel. Phil looked at the land across the fence line. He was 61 years old and had been farming since he was 16. I borrowed $60,000 in 1979 for equipment I don't still have. I know you did. And you've been putting money in the bank since then. Trying to. Phil looked at his boots. A 1962 Massey Ferguson 35 with a Lister engine and an orange vinyl seat had just purchased 160 acres of Alberta farmland. The logic of it was simple enough that it embarrassed him to have missed it. It's not really about the tractor, is it? It never was. What is it about, then? Hazel looked at the field that was now hers, flat and dark under the spring sky. My father told me that if you own your tools, you own your work. If you own your work, you keep what it earns. If somebody else owns your tools, they own a piece of everything you'll ever make. He said it about a wrench. He meant it about everything. Phil put his cap back on. He had known Clarence Drummond well enough to know that sounded exactly like him. Your dad was a hard man to argue with. He lost maybe 3 arguments in his whole life. I don't think any of them were with me. Hazel farmed the combined quarter sections until 2007, when she was 61. She transitioned the operation over 2 years to her nephew, a young man named Carter Drummond, Ken's son, who'd spent enough summers on the property to know the land, the shop, and the ledger in the way that comes from repetition rather than instruction. Carter runs the farm today. The Massey Ferguson 35 is in the shed. The Lister-Petter engine has run for more than 12,000 hours on Hazel's adapter plate and has not required internal work of any kind. The Massey drivetrain, the rear end that was already 25 years old when Hazel bought it for scrap weight, is still turning through all 6 speeds withaut complaint. The drill press in the shop is the same one Clarence bought in 1958. The floor jack from the Red Deer service station is in the corner. The workbench, rough-cut spruce, built by Clarence's hands in 1955, still carries the ring stains from 30 years of coffee cups and the shallow groove worn into the edge where a vise jaw rode too long without being replaced. Carter's daughter is 12. She's already been shown how to use the drill press. In the fall of 2009, the Innisfail and District Agricultural Society asked Hazel to speak at their annual recognition dinner. She was 63 and had been retired from daily operations for 2 years and had never spoken publicly about any of this. She agreed only because Carter said she should, and because she trusted Carter's judgment, the way she'd trusted Clarence's, which was completely and without requiring a reason. She stood at the lectern with a note card she'd written in the truck on the way over. She read from it once and then set it down. People ask me how I built a working tractor for $5, $10. That's not the question worth asking. The question worth asking is why everyone around me was paying $9,000 for the same work. I didn't do anything clever. I looked at what I had, looked at what I needed, and found the shortest, honest path between them. Clarence called that common sense. I think he was being polite. She stopped for a moment. The room was quiet. My father taught me that a machine is only worth what it costs you to do the work. If the work costs $510, then $9,000 is not a better machine. It is an $8,500 decision about who owns your future. She looked up. I bought 160 acres of good land in 1996 because my tractor cost $500 instead of $9,000. Because I did my own repairs instead of paying a dealer. Because I had no debt, and therefore no one who could take anything from me when the price of wheat went the wrong direction. People looked at my tractor and saw a salvage machine. I looked at their loan statements and felt the same way. She stepped back from the lectern. The room was quiet for a moment, and then it wasn't. Phil Warwick was in the audience. He was 71, retired, and had sold both his John Deere 2040s in the 90s to meet obligations on a land loan that had not worked out. He sat in a folding chair listening to a woman say, in plain language, the thing he had spent 40 years learning through the harder school. He found her in the parking lot after. $510. $510, she said. I spent more than that on a hydraulic hose repair in 1994. Hazel smiled. She didn't say anything. He looked at the dark field across the road. Your father raised someone who understood what money is actually for. No. He raised someone who understood what it isn't for. The rest was straightforward. She got in her truck and drove home on the flat road through the dark Alberta evening. Behind her, in a shed on a paid-for farm, a 1962 Massey Ferguson sat in the dark with a Lister-Petter engine that had never given her a reason to doubt it, on an adapter plate she had built herself, on a drivetrain that was older than most of the farmers who'd laughed when she bought it. The auctioneer had apologized for listing it. The county had made it a punchline. And somewhere under that dark Alberta sky, the machine sat on its paid-for land, belonging entirely to the person who had understood, from the beginning, that the most expensive piece of equipment is never the one with the highest price. It's the one that owns more of your future than you do. There's an image I keep coming back to. Hazel Drummond standing at a lectern in a community hall in Innisfail, a note card she'd written in the truck sitting face down on the wood, speaking without it. Not because she'd rehearsed, because she'd lived it long enough that the words had nowhere else to go. What she said that evening wasn't complicated. It wasn't meant to be. The most honest things rarely are. I think about what it actually took for a woman in rural Alberta in 1987 to walk into a salvage auction, bid $85 on a machine everyone else had written off, and then spend 14 months turning that machine into something better than new. Not because she was reckless, because she'd already done the math, because she'd spent 11 months before that auction measuring, planning, sourcing an engine from a collapsed generator set in Lacombe, working out the geometry of an adapter plate on graph paper before she ever raised her hand to bid. That's not impulse. That's the kind of clear-eyed thinking that most people talk about and very few actually practice. What Hazel had, what I think of when I think about her, was a kind of integrity that doesn't announce itself. It's the integrity of a person who tells the truth to their ledger even when the truth is inconvenient, or doesn't let the gap between what something costs and what it's worth go unexamined. Clarence raised her that way. Not with speeches, with a shop and a set of tools and the daily demonstration that honesty about your own situation is not pessimism. It's the only foundation that holds. And then there's what she understood. The thing that separated her from every farmer in that township who was carrying debt in 1988. She didn't just know how to fix an engine. She knew why fixing it herself mattered beyond the cost of the repair. Every dollar she didn't spend on a dealer invoice was a dollar that stayed on the farm. Every piece of equipment she kept running instead of replacing was a decision that compounded forward. She understood that the numbers were never just about the numbers. They were about what the numbers made possible 20 years down the road. Phil Warwick understood machines. Hazel understood what machines were for. And then she waited. That's the part I find hardest to hold on to properly, because waiting is not passive. Waiting while you're working, saving, maintaining, learning. That's one of the most demanding things a person can do. Hazel didn't wait for something to happen to her. She prepared for a specific moment she knew would come eventually, without knowing exactly when. And when the Hendricks place came to sale in 1996, she was ready. Not lucky. Ready. Those are different things, and it matters that we're honest about which one it was. I think what Clarence gave her, and what she eventually passed to Carter, is something that doesn't fit neatly into any single word. It's the combination of knowing what's right and doing it even when no one's watching, understanding a problem clearly enough to see through it to the solution, and staying with the work long past the point where most people would have found an easier way out. Those three things together are what 510 and a Lister-Petter engine actually bought. The land was just where they showed up on a Tuesday afternoon in spring. The auctioneer apologized for listing that tractor. Hazel drove home with 160 acres.